Hello everybody, and welcome to this, my third of 3 videos on the Nikon F5. In the first video we covered what everything on the camera is, and in the second video we covered how to do most everything this camera can do photographically. In this video we're going to talk about the custom functions, all 24 of them. Before we get into the custom functions, let's talk about how to navigate the custom functions menu. To adjust your custom functions, you're going to have to hold down the custom functions button the entire time. If you let it go, it's going to turn off. So I'm going to go scroll through 24 here. These right here are 0A or 0B. Now the rear command wheel, which is this one, the rear command wheel, before we get too far, is the one that's going to select the function. The front command wheel right here is the one that's going to select the function setting. So to rotate to a specific function, we use the rear command wheel, and to determine what we want that function to be, we use the front. Now, first thing, when you start off in the custom function menu, you're going to see this right here, 0A and 0B. This allows you to store two different sets of custom functions. So if you said, I want to set up a set of custom functions for bird photography and another one for portraits, you could do that very easily. And then you could set up the autofocus and the metering and things like that and all of the different custom function areas to work in ways that are more well suited for the two different types of photography. Custom function 1 is your continuous servo autofocus. 0 is the default, as I believe is the case with all 24 of these. And this means release priority. 1 means focus priority. Okay, so personally, for this, what this does is when you are in your C autofocus mode with your autofocus switch on the front of the camera, CS and M, C is continuous servo. This applies only to that mode. And what this does is tell the camera in 0, when you have that 1 right there set to 0, the camera says, okay, I'm going to shoot whether or not I know for a fact that focus is accurate. If I think it's accurate, I'll take a photo. With 1, your camera will absolutely wait until it knows focus is locked. Now the advantage to 1 is you only have 36 frames, so you're going to have a better chance of getting your frames in focus. However, with 0, you can have a better chance of, you'll at least be taking photos. So it's a matter of personal preference. When I have a camera that has a limit on how many frames it can have, especially one that will burn through 8 of those frames in a second, I would much rather have focus priority rather than release priority. Function 2 is the exact same thing, except for single servo autofocus. So on the autofocus switch on the front, when you have it set to S, function 2 applies to that. Custom function 3 is your bracketing order. So at the end of video 2, when we talked about the bracketing sequence up here, under, proper, over, or whatever, a third of a stop, full stop, all of that jazz. This function here is the one that tells the camera what order to do those exposures in. So 0 is proper, under, over, and 1 is under, proper, over. Totally a matter of personal preference how you want to have this set up. I personally prefer 1 because it makes it easier for me to recognize the bracketed photos on the negatives when they come back. But if it's easier for you to find the proper one first and then under and over, whatever works best for you. Custom function 4 is your autofocus with shutter half pressed. With 0, the autofocus starts with the shutter being half pressed. With 1, the autofocus on button controls when autofocus turns on and off. And so this is a matter of personal preference and shooting style, which one you'd prefer, and just the kinds of situations you're going to be in as a photographer. Okay, so let's talk about custom function 5, because this is a bit of a confusing one. So there are two options, 0 and 1. In 0, exposure is locked when the AEL, AFL button, both of these options apply to how this button functions, are pressed. In 1, it also locks the shutter speed and aperture. Now it sounds like that's the same thing, but it's not. In 0, it locks focus and exposure value. So 1/125th and f5.6 is the same as 1/60th and f8, or as 1/250th and f4. In 0, the camera could shift between different aperture and shutter speed combinations to maintain that proper exposure level as long as that button is pressed, and it will also maintain focus. Or it will lock the focus, rather, on the spot that it was at. With 1, the camera will lock the actual shutter speed and aperture values. So if you press AEL, AFL at 1/125th, f5, 6, it will stay there with 1. With 0, it could shift to 1/60th and f8 if it wanted to. For custom function 5, the way you set it up is really just a matter of personal preference and how you like to have your camera function. Custom function 6 is your command dial rotation. 0 is counterclockwise, 1 is clockwise, and it's just a matter of personal preference how you want that to go. 7 is your AEL, which is auto exposure lock, with your shutter. So in 0, your auto exposure does not lock when you press your shutter button halfway down. With 1, when you switch to setting 1, your exposure values lock when you half press your shutter button. So basically, if you set custom function 5 to option 1 in combination with this setup, it allows the camera to have continuous autofocus with auto exposure lock. Bit of advanced use there. Generally speaking, it's a matter of personal preference how you want that to be set up. Custom function 8 is the auto film loading when the camera is closed. Now, if you remember from video 2, I loaded the camera, I had to hit the shutter button, and then it started advancing. With option 0, the film advances when the shutter back closes. With option 1, the film advances when you press the shutter button. Why the film didn't advance automatically, I can't tell you. It just was not behaving a few minutes ago. Anyway, it's personal preference how you want to set this. Function 9 is the film advance speed in continuous high. So your options are CH8 and CH6. Okay, CH6 is 6 frames per second and CH8 is 8 frames per second. Just a matter of personal preference and how quickly you want to go through film. Custom function 10 is your film advance speed in continuous low. And your options are continuous low, 3, 4, and 5. So 3 frames, 4 frames, or 5 frames per second in low. And again, this is a matter of personal preference and how fast you want your film to go. Custom function 11 is your alert LED in bulb mode. Disabled is 0. 1 is enabled. Now what this does is that there's an LED on the back of the camera. This one right here, I believe it is. On the top. I believe it's the same as your film rewind light right up there. And that blinks in setting 1, that blinks when your bulb shooting is active. And that lets you know that a bulb exposure is going on. So for instance, if you had this camera sitting out on the, at a beach doing a star trails over the ocean, you could see from your, campfire that the light was still blinking and the bulb exposure was going on and your batteries hadn't died, for instance. So does not affect the exposure at all, and it's just a matter of personal preference as to whether or not you want the blinking light when you do a bulb exposure. Custom function 12 is the auto film stop. In 0, the film advances until the end of the roll. So if you roll your own film and you try to put 40 or 42 frames into a cassette, with option 0, you can eke those extra handful of frames out of it. E36, the camera will stop at the 36th frame automatically for 36 exposure rolls. In 35, it will stop at 35 automatically. With this, one thing you can do with E35 is you get a little bit more blank space on your negative. And what you can do is you can take a Sharpie or a piece of masking tape and you can record some notes about your film or your development, if you develop at home, on the actual negative strip and keep it with the film when you put it into the sleeve. 13 is multiple exposures. 0 is automatically cancel rather. 1 is does not cancel. Now, if you remember from the second video when we were doing the double exposures, after the second exposure, the double exposure indicator would go away. And if you are in 0 mode, that's how that behaves. If you set it to 1, then after your double exposure, the camera is going to do another double exposure for you. It's a personal preference matter and also how often you shoot double exposures. If you're going to be doing roll after roll or even an entire roll of double exposures, it makes sense just to turn this to setting 1. Custom function 14 is your center weighted metering option. And these are a 12 millimeter circle, or is that 15? I can't tell, I'm reading it upside down. It must be 15. Nope, 12 millimeter, 15, 20 millimeter, automatic. Oh, full A is for full screen averaging. PC is for setting your own custom center weighted metering area size with your PC controls. Honestly, I have no idea how to do that. I don't know that the software for that is supported by any current version of Windows anymore. And then C8 is your 8 millimeter setting. Okay, so the numbers C8, 12, 15, and 20 are the millimeter size diameter of the center weighted area in the center of your frame. It's just a matter of how much of how small an area you personally want to have contributing to 75% of the metering. You can also set this to full scene averaging, which turns the meter, instead of a center weighted meter, into a completely standard full averaging meter. Custom function 15 is the metering time off delay, and your options are 8 seconds, 16, 32, and 4. Totally a matter of personal preference. I like 16 personally, but if you want your meter to turn off more quickly or to take longer, you just adjust it however you like. Custom function 16 is your self-timer delay, and now this you can adjust on a second-by-second basis from 2 seconds up to 60. It's just a matter of how long you need it to be. Custom function 17 is a bit confusing, so we're going to go through this. It has a number of different options. What this does is affect the way that bracketing is done in manual shooting. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is take a look at these next 4 options. They are 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, and 11, or 1, 1. The 1 symbolize on, and the 0 symbolizes off. And the A symbolizes flash, okay? So with 1-1A, what that means is that in manual mode, when you bracket, your shutter speed, aperture, and flash power, if you have a flash connected, will all be shifted automatically by the camera. If it needs to adjust one or more or all 3 of those, it will adjust whatever it needs to adjust in order to obtain the proper bracketing sequence in your on your film. With 1-0A, it will adjust the shutter speed and flash power only. So shutter speed, aperture, flash. Okay. So where there's 1, it says, yes, I will adjust it. 2 is no, I will not adjust it. So basically this is 0 right here. This is the default setting. The next option is 0-1A, which is aperture, shutter speed will not be adjusted, aperture and flash will be. And then 0-0A, shutter speed and aperture will not be adjusted. If you are using a flash, then the flash will be adjusted. Now this applies again only to manual mode and how the camera is going to adjust the power out, the light reaching your film to achieve that bracketing sequence. So it's totally a matter of personal preference, how you want it to be. I'm going to leave mine on 1-0A. That's the one that I think makes the most sense. And it's the default, so that's convenient. All right, custom function 18 is your focusing screen compensation. Now what this does is this adjusts the exposure compensation automatically for focusing screens that require it. Not all focusing screens for this camera do. There will be no display in your LCD screen or viewfinder that your exposure is being adjusted automatically by the camera with this. It just does it in the background, okay? With screens C, F, G, G screens 1 through 4, and U, those require compensation, and you can find the information for those with your screen or in the manual, how much to adjust. And then it's just a matter of dialing in the exact amount of exposure compensation you need. If you are not using one of those specific screens that needs compensation adjustment, just leave it at 0. 19, custom function 19, is your prolonged shutter speed. With 0, your shutter speeds are 1/8,000th of a second up to 1/30th. With 0, your shutter speeds are 1/8,000th of a second to 30 seconds. with one that extends to 30 minutes. So it's a matter of personal preference and how often you plan to use long exposures. If you can't fathom a reason to ever take a picture longer than 30 seconds, leave it to 0. But if you plan to do star trails or astrophotographies or low light macro photographies or any of the other types of things you could think of that need a 30-minute exposure, then you might want to just set this to 1 and have the camera do the counting for you automatically. Custom function 20 is your TTL flash sync speed. So TTL is your through the lens light meter setting. Okay. Basically, what this allows you to do is set the fastest shutter speed that your flash will sync at. So when we talked about setting it to 300, this is where you can do it. And as I noted, with 300, you don't quite get full flash power because it is slightly faster than the actual flash sync speed. So 2/50th is the maximum flash sync speed at which you get full flash power. And you can dial this back if you want to as slow as 1/60th of a second. Now what this does is basically just put a governor on your flash sync speed. Whatever you want to leave it to, it's just a matter of personal preference and how you use your camera. 21 is your AEL AFL button function. I know we already went through this. What the heck? Well, there's another option for this. 21 locks. LL is lock. When you push the AEL AFL button, it locks both your exposure and your focus. When it says AEL, that button only locks exposure. When it says AFL, that button only locks focus. How this affects the previous custom function that we talked about with this, I honestly could not tell you. Custom function 22 is your aperture setting with the sub-command dial. And that's basically the aperture is set with the sub-command dial in 0, which means the front command dial, by the way. So in 0, you're using the front command wheel to adjust the aperture setting of your lens through your camera. With 1, this overrides that. So your lens now controls the aperture setting of the lens for your camera, not the front dial. So for instance, this could really work well if your front dial's jacked up or something along those lines, and it would give you the ability to control it through your lens, or if your contacts are messed up. But if you want to have a shooting setup that is closest to what we recognize now as standard with digital cameras, that would be 0. Custom function 23 is whether or not you have focus indicators in your viewfinder. So with 0 rather, you do triangles in the display, which is in the viewfinder display, by the way, up in here, will indicate whether or not you are focused in front of or behind your subject. With 1, there are no triangles. So this is just a matter of personal preference and how much information you want in your viewfinder display. 24 is your auto exposure with flash exposure bracketing. Now what this does is in 0, so this works the same way as the previous one did with the 0s and the 1s. On, and E for exposure, I guess. Anyway, this is your default setting right here. When bracketing, both auto exposure and flash compensation are performed for bracketing. Now that's when you have an automatic or semi-automatic mode and a flash connected to your camera right there. That means that it will do automatic exposure and flash compensation. And this, by the way, stands for the automatic exposure and the flash. That's the 1-1, automatic exposure and flash. Those are the two ones being on for compensation. This setting is 10E, automatic exposure only. The 1 for automatic exposure, 0 for flash. Flash compensation will not be used to assist in automatic or semi-automatic mode bracketing. 01E, the flash only will be used if you have a flash connected to the camera to assist in automatic exposure mode, which is program shutter priority or aperture priority bracketing. Completely a matter of personal preference and how you want to use your camera. And that is all. Oh, my hand is so cramped. That is all 24 of the custom functions in the Nikon F5, the most advanced camera, the most advanced 35mm film camera that Nikon ever released. an absolutely marvelous piece of camera technology and engineering, and just an absolute joy to use. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope this video helped demystify some of those custom functions, and I'll see you guys in the next video.